channel. I mentioned to you about establishing a quorum, and as soon as we do that, Elvia Diaz will call the roll and we will establish a quorum. I mentioned to you that there are 3 proposed consent items. And then I'm pleased this morning that we're going to talk about the Williamson Act. And by the way, Peter Detweiler, who is our chief consultant for local government, came up this morning with a match folder that he will show you if you ask him, that has Mr. Williamson's name on it as an assemblyman, and said that if you like the Williamson Act, vote for me again for assembly. I think that's essentially what it said. We will be pleased this morning to have Senator Lois Wolk as well as Assemblyman Ana Caballero join us. They share some interest in this very important topic. The dramatic cut in direct state subventions to counties has certainly caused many to question our commitment to agricultural land and open space conservation, and to the William Act in particular. Just last week, I'm sure you know that the Imperial County Supervisors voted to non-renew their Williamson Act. So as we ask questions this morning, they are fact-finding questions. And they are not designed to put anybody on the spot, but we are going to ask you some hard questions this morning relative to your county, if you're a member of the Board of Supervisors, and your intention. We hope today that the legislators will use today's hearing to learn more about the state's most important land conservation program so that we can speak up in any other committee hearings, budget debates, as well as caucus meetings. So this morning we're going to listen very closely to the county officials, to the conservation groups, and landowners about when and about where they think we should be going in the future. But because we don't have a quorum and because we do in fact have staff in place, we're going to ask Mr. Peter Detweiler to begin by briefing our staff on the Williamson Act, past, present, and future, and to begin by providing us with the legislative oversight that has been prepared. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Senator Cox and Senator Anastad. My briefing this morning for you is really quite simple. I simply want to unpack the formal name of the Williamson Act. It's the California Land Conservation Act of 1965. And by looking at each of those words, I think we unpack the meaning of the act, and that's going to allow you to better understand the speakers that will come after me. First of all, it's the California Land Conservation Act of 1965. And California is just like the rest of the United States, only more so. And just like California, in the Williamson Act, there are multiple goals going on simultaneously. You're going to see how this act started out with one theme, and then other interest groups piled on. Their hopes and fears and dreams of California were placed into the Williamson Act as the program matured. You're going to see a California statute that fits the state's complex geography, its intricate demography, and political compromises. So the first part of it is the California Land Conservation Act. The second certainly is land. And this is about the literal foundation of our state and of the values that we hold. About 1/3 of all privately owned non-forested land is subject to the Williamson Act, about 16.6 million acres. And as Tip O'Neill taught us, all politics is local. So what about your counties as state senators? The tan handout that the sergeant will distribute shows you published numbers from the State Department of Conservation with acreage numbers on one side and the Williamson Act subvention claims on the others. And because you collectively represent so many counties in California, particularly Northern California, I wanted you to have that information. This is a statute about land. It begins with science-based definitions of prime agricultural land, non-prime land. It has economically based thresholds for the land that qualifies.
Mr. Detweiler, if you could just
of course
pause right there.
Yes, sir.
We'll ask Ms. Diaz to call the roll to establish the quorum.
Senators Cox?
Aye. Here.
Here. Cox here. Kehoe? Here. Kehoe here. Onestad? Onestad here. Price? Wiggins?
Ms. Caballero, come up, please, if you would. And Peter, if you will continue to hold that thought for just
Absolutely.
a second. We do, in fact, have 3 bills that are on consent. I presume that motion made by Senator Onestad. Call the roll, please.
On the consent calendar, Senators Cox?
Aye.
Cox, aye. Onestad? Aye. Onestad, aye. Kehoe? Aye. Kehoe, aye. Price? Wiggins?
We'll hold the roll. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, did you say 2 or 3 bills were on consent?
3 bills.
3. Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. 3 bills. We will, in fact, hold the roll open to give our 2, Mr. Price, as well as, who else is coming? Senator Wilkins right outside. And Senator Wilkins, of course, is not on the committee, but
Senator Wiggins.
I understood Ms. Wiggins would not be here this morning, but we'll give Mr. Price the opportunity to add on when he gets here. All right. Now, Mr. Detweiler, continue with where you left off, sir.
Thank you. We were talking about the formal name of the Williamson Act, the California Land Conservation Act of 1965. And land really is literally the foundation of this state. And it begins with the initial hope of farmers and ranchers, because land is the basis of their economic lives. County supervisors look to this kind of a land-based program as a non-regulatory tool that helps them guide land use. And very importantly, it helps them avoid public service costs and public facility costs that would come with additional development. County assessors look to the land to avoid the heavy taxation of rural lands. County planners have looked at this land use program because these voluntary contracts complement general plans and specific plans, subdivision regulations, and zoning. And conservation interests have looked to this land for soil conservation, water conservation, and more recently, habitat conservation opportunities. Certainly, environmental groups look at this land-based program for open space retention, for landscape retention. And you'll see in the briefing paper and the witnesses you're going to hear from this morning about discussions about opportunities to use the Land Conservation Act to implement AB 32, SB 375, and the recent package of Delta legislation. And candidly, other groups are interested in the Williamson Act as well. Builders and speculators have seen the act as a chance to reduce the holding costs for their businesses before they apply for development approvals. So the California Land Conservation Act, conservation is about the wise use of resources, not its permanent preservation, not locking up resources. And I believe that your predecessors in the legislature and Mr. Williamson as the author made a deliberate choice of that term. This is conservation like Gifford Pinchot. It's not preservation like John Muir. And grudgingly, farmland and ranches and open space give way to development on the edges of our metropolitan regions through non-renewal and through contract cancellations. And those elements are described for you in the briefing paper. Land Conservation Act, it's an act. It's a conscious legislative decision made by your predecessors in 1965, and it involves 3 bodies of law. In your briefing paper on page 1, at the bottom, we noted for you those 3 statutes, those 3 wheels that interlock to bring you this program. The Williamson Act, with the voluntary contracts, part of the government code. Mandatory reassessments of contracted land in the Revenue and Taxation Code, backed up with constitutional provisions. And what has been an important subvention program to counties in the government code and in your annual budgets. On page 3, I've listed for you the legislative findings. Why is this act important to California? Here's what the statute says, and I wanted you to see those words. And today, there's an important chance for you to think about what a Williamson Act version 2.0 might look like. What comes after this act? Because this act, passed in 1965, it's the California Land Conservation Act of 1965. Like every law, it reflects the historical, economic, and political context that existed at the time. Page 5 of the briefing paper sketches some of that for you, and there's a chart on pages 6 and 7 that gives you key highlighted dates. This was an act that the legislature passed before we had robust planning and zoning laws. Those didn't come about until the late 1960s, 1971, for the vertical consistency requirement. It's before CEQA. That's 1970. It's before active LAFCOs with their spheres of influence, 1970, municipal service reviews in 2000. It's before the legislature created alternative easement programs in 1974, 1979, 1982, and 1995. And certainly it's before the Serrano decisions and Proposition 13, which fundamentally changed the fiscal landscape that you have to operate in. Now, like any other 45-year-old, the Williamson Act may be facing a midlife crisis. The shock of the lost subventions done through the governor's blue pencil authority has caused many to question your commitment to the long-time conservation of open space, farmland, and ranch lands. The members of this committee and the other interested legislators are going to have opportunities to talk about these programs in other policy committees. Many of you will be directly involved in budget debates, and some of you will have these discussions behind closed doors within your own party caucuses. So this hearing today is an opportunity for you to listen carefully to the witnesses that follow me, to think about short-term reactions in 2002, possible restoration of these lost subventions, and then to think about longer-term actions that may occur starting in 2011. You may want to rethink the property tax relief. Page 12 of your briefing paper raises questions about looking into what other states have done with income tax relief as opposed to property tax relief. Page 13 suggests a number of questions that I've heard about finding a new revenue stream to replace the general fund for subventions. The panels that we've organized for you this morning, 20 minutes for county officials, 20 minutes for conservation interests, 20 minutes for landowners, allows these speakers to give you about 5 minutes of conversation, gives you plenty of time for questions and answers. And if you choose, there are suggested questions that you may want to ask these speakers beginning on pages 10 and 13. So, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, that is my briefing to get you started this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Detweiler. Let's see if there are any questions of the committee. Ms. Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Detweiler, thank you. And it looks like a good briefing paper. On this this sheet,
Yep.
Could we go into a little more detail?
Right.
Why are some counties omitted? Los Angeles and San Mateo.
Not all counties participate in the Williamson Act. So of the 58 counties in California, 53 are participants. And so San Francisco and San Mateo and I believe Alpine, among others, do not offer the Williamson Act. It's a voluntary program, a cooperative, collaborative effort between the county supervisors and landowners.
So the counties more or less they had to opt in?
They have opted in over the years. And you're going to hear this morning from the Department of Conservation, which monitors these programs, and Mr. Leahy will probably have more specific information for you.
And would you mind just briefly going across the top there? Are there different rates for their prime and non-prime, and then the security zone versus conservation easements and all that? Just walk me through it.
Very quickly, because Mr. Leahy knows this far better than I do. On one side of the paper, you see acres, the amount of acreage enrolled, and that's where this begins. So, for example, Senator, in San Diego County, about 4,800 acres of prime agricultural land is enrolled under the Williamson Act, 57,000 acres of non-prime land, and for a total of 62,000 acres participating in the program. San Diego County does not yet offer the Farmland Security Program or the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Those acreage numbers, matched up against statutory formulas, drive the claims for payments which are on the flip side. So in 2007, you'll see that San Diego claimed $23,000 in state subventions for their prime land, $56,000 for their non-prime land, for a total claim of about $80,000.
And the subvention, what is it supposed to do? Buy down the property tax or something?
These are payments that the State General Fund makes directly to counties to make up some of the lost property tax revenues that the counties don't get because the land has been reassessed downward. And on a statewide basis, this grew to almost $39 million a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Caballero, any questions of Mr. Detweiler? Mr. Price? And you haven't done okay? Senator Onnested? Now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to stop right here and pause for just a second and give Mr. Price the opportunity to vote on the consent calendar.
On the consent calendar, Senator Price? Aye. Price, aye.
It's our understanding that all right, consent calendar's out. It's our understanding that the other member will not be here today. So with that, we now are going to call up the county committees, the Honorable Judy Chase, Honorable Susan Thompson, and Ted James of the County of Kern. If you will come up, take a seat. We have allocated a total of 20 minutes for this panel to make its presentation. We will give you exactly the same opportunities we've given in the past, and that is that one person may take the entire 20 minutes. You will not be particularly popular with the panel, but you're welcome to take the entire 20 minutes, but that's all you get. So you decide how you want to divide it up, and because we are televising this, if you in fact will just state your name for the purposes of the identification. Ms. Chase.
Certainly. My name is Judy Case. I'm the chairman of the Fresno County Board of Supervisors. I'd like to thank all the committee, Mr. Chairman, and all committee members for allowing us this opportunity this morning. And today I'm here on behalf of CSAC, the California Association of Counties, which represents all the counties in the state of California.
Good job.
I certainly appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you the county's perspective on the past, present, and future of the Williamson Act. Counties recognize that agriculture is a very important industry for all of us. We are the leading agricultural state in the entire United States, and we're quite proud in Fresno County. We are the leading county in the entire United States and produce more than some states do. One of the best tools available is to ensure that the Williamson Act continues. It allows our farmers to have an opportunity to stay in business, and this is one of the many tools that they use. We also believe that without this incentive, that the pressure to sell their lands to developers could become overwhelming, and we will lose that land forever to the ability to produce agricultural products. This program allows many farmers over the state to keep their land in ag production because their property taxes are maintained at an affordable rate. Now, I know everybody likes to talk about that 3% multiplier into the economy for any industry, but let me tell you, a lot of businesses depend upon the ag industry for their livelihood. And when you get to the rural communities, the car dealers, the grocery stores, every small business depends on this industry to remain healthy. And we're seeing a lot of impact in some of our small rural towns. In 2007, Fresno County growers and ranchers had a net operating loss of 42%. A net operating loss of 42%. And this was prior to the economic downturn we're currently seeing and the water shortages. So I can only comment that in the last 2 years, the farmers' net operating loss, an example, we've had 8 long-term packing houses shut their doors. Each one of those packing houses employs anywhere from 100 to 500 employees. So all of those individuals lost their job during that. Dairies have experienced major hardships. Many of the dairies have been shutting down. We know of 50. The unemployment in Fresno County is currently at 16.8%. Our rural cities are facing unemployment as high as 41%. The ag industry is most certainly on edge. County government, as the administrator of the state program, is caught with 10 to 20-year contracts with no ability to sustain the program without the state subvention. I would like to point out that we strongly believe that the financial support from the state has provided tangible incentives for counties to stay in the program, initiating more contracts and to continue providing valuable public service. Unfortunately, with the loss of this important state subvention, the fiscal responsibility is falling wholly on the counties. Similar to the state, counties are also faced with making tough decisions due to the declining revenues and significant budget shortfalls we are all dealing with. Another year without this support from the state may be the last straw for some counties struggling to provide essential public services. Fresno County put subvention funding into our budget this year. We have a $4.8 million hole as a result of it. We've been able to scrape together savings and other things and cobble that together for this year, but next year it will be very troubling for all of us, and I don't know that even Fresno County can sustain this program without your help. At the suggestion of this committee, CSAC conducted a survey of the counties regarding their plans for addressing the loss of Williamson Act subvention. A summary of the results have been provided to all of you. As noted, the survey was sent to 58 counties on February 19th of this year, and we've received 23 responses back. We view these responses as a snapshot in time. They're likely to change, and they're primarily dependent on what the state and the county's fiscal health is at any given time. While several responding counties indicated a willingness to hold the line last year, and like I said, we put it in our budget in Fresno County, and when it wasn't funded, we decided not to eliminate the program, but to sustain it for one more year, and that has been quite a challenge for our county. I don't believe we'll be able to do that next year. And I'd like to comment that once that issue of non-renewal is put forth, it's unlikely to go back there. It costs us a lot of money for our staff time, sending notices. Once you start the process to reinitiate it, you have to take each contract, evaluate it for its ag potential, recalculate it to send it back out there. And I just don't see how counties are going to do that in this environment. So it's really important to have the continuity there, or the program will certainly not survive. Beyond the ag and the associated economic benefits of the Williamson Act, the environmental rewards are significant. Simply put, in many instances throughout California, the Williamson Act has helped to curb urban sprawl. As previously noted, when farmers have an ongoing economic ability to continue keeping their land in production, the incentive to sell is minimized. Not only has this kept thousands of acres of prime farmland in production, but has assured that the land is maintained in open space rather than new suburbs. California has long been the leader in environmental movement. With the legislation such as AB 32 and 375, California has the obligation to move forward, and we're working with this. We need these tools to help our farmers stay in business. It is our hope that state leaders will demonstrate their commitment to the program by reinvesting in the long-term success. As an organization with a long history of supporting the program, CSAC is open to looking at revisions to the Act if that's what needs to be done, and we would like to be able to keep the program going and provide property owners greater incentive to continue participation in this important program. We'd like to preserve the integrity of the program and eliminate abuses resulting in unjustified and premature conversion of contracted land for development. We will work with you for those revisions as appropriate. We certainly feel that that could help strengthen this program overall, but our ultimate goal is to preserve our agricultural industry and our open space in the state of California. We are also open to vetting other funding and policy options with our members. So we want to be your partner, but I can't impress upon you enough. If counties start issuing notices of non-renewal, we will be going down a path that will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reverse.
Ms. Case, thank you very much. Any questions of Supervisor Case? All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, I didn't have a chance to go through these figures, but in terms of, most of the counties are in a holding pattern, but are there others that have actually begun the process of non-renewal?
Imperial County has done just exact that.
Just one.
From discussions with my colleagues, it's very likely Fresno County will go there next year if we don't have support.
Does CSAC have a group that's talking about reform to the Williamson Act or change in the Williamson Act, the Williamson Act 2.0, or things that might be?
I'm going to let Karen talk maybe a little bit about the specifics when that comes up. We have talked about ways to strengthen it, and we would support that. My county has strengthened our own rules just going back. Anytime a property changes hand, we want to relook at that and make sure that that is a continuing use and it's not just something being held off for development or a quick changeover for development purposes. A long time ago, Fresno County did a lot of rural residential development. We've stopped that because we believe it's really important to preserve our ag land. And Williamson Act is one of those tools, and it's allowed a number of farmers to stay in business, and they are just at the very edge. If they don't have that tool, their land costs go up tremendously with increase in their property tax. They won't be in business any longer.
All right. Any other questions? Mr. Price.
Thank you for your testimony. You mentioned the kind of financial hit, I guess, that the county is going to take if this program is eliminated. Can you tell us exactly, kind of roughly what that number is and what percentage of your overall budget does that represent?
We have the total subvention for the state of California is about $35 million. Fresno County receives $5.6 million.
I'm sorry,
$5.6 million. That hit is a direct general fund hit, and so it competes with other general funded departments for revenue. That includes our sheriff's department, all of our public safety departments, our agricultural department, auditor, controller, assessor. So that impact is really difficult to backfill because those departments are already stretched to the ultimate limit. Overall, Fresno County has a very large budget, $1.7 billion, but there's a very small amount of that that's discretionary to the county. And so what it really starts to hit is more of our safety services than anywhere else, because we've cut those other departments down to 80% in an effort to preserve some public safety. So I don't know how we can cut below 80% of the other departments.
Your question,
yes.
Mr. Price?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Armstead, any questions of Ms. Price? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Want to move
Committee
right
members.
along. Ms. Thompson?
Yes, Susan Thompson. I'm the County Administrative Officer of the County of San Benito, and I'm here this morning. I'm very pleased to see Ana Caballero here. She is our representative in the Assembly, and thank you very much for being here. I'm here today both representing my county and also the Regional Council of Rural Counties, RCRC. We have been working together with CSAC and with in partnership with environmental groups, with conservation groups, with ag groups, so that we are willing to work with you. And I think in direct answer to the previous question, we do have a coalition ready to work with you, if need be, to amend the act. But the big concern for us today is that we'd like to get the message across loud and clear that it is critical for small counties. It is a huge percentage of our budget. Let me give you an example. In San Benito County, of our discretionary revenue that we can spend on law enforcement, on all those things that we get no other subventions for, this subvention is about 3.5%. However, when we look at what we had to cut, including property taxes and all other cuts we took last year to balance our budget, the loss of Williamson Act was 30% of what we lost. Huge to us. So it did result in the elimination of sheriff's deputies. It did result in the elimination of probation officers, 911 comm officers. We had to go throughout we took about 10% of our employee groups down. So there was a significant problem. The bigger message today, that is important, but the bigger message that I'm here to send is that we all believe that Williamson Act is good policy. We believe that it produced the intended effects that were stated by the legislature at its enactment, and that those intentions are as relevant today as they were when they were first signed into law in 1965. Again, we have a broad-based coalition that supports full funding of the Williamson Act subvention Because of the many important benefits of the Act, which have been enumerated for you already this morning, I will not repeat, but they are very broad-reaching. We will work with you. We will continue to help you because we believe this is something that is very important to all of us, not just the counties, but all of our industry and economy. The Williamson Act Subvention Program is a 38-year partnership that we have had between the counties, the state, and landowners. It's a fiscal partnership that works. In fact, our boards over the years have made very, very important decisions to increase the amount of acreage in the Act because of the awareness that we had the subvention available. And so we all bought into the very good concepts of saving agricultural land for production, as well as for open space and habitat, and all of the other wonderful benefits that come out of it. We had a partnership. We need that partnership to continue, fiscally as well as in policy. It's very, very important to us. We are a very small county, but we have a very productive agricultural lands, and we want to keep those in production. That's who we are. One of the points I also wanted to make, I think there was a number of interesting concepts we all believe that were expressed in your committee report. Again, we'd like to vet some of those concepts with you. We don't want to reject anything out of hand, but we do really need to see your commitment to this long-term relationship with us and going forward. My Board of Supervisors, in fact, did not start cancellations, but they have taken the action to take no further new applications. And they took that immediately after the governor's blue penciling. So right now we're taking no new applications. Again, the Williamson Act has been fully embraced for decades by San Benito County. Fully 76% of our privately owned land in our county is in the Act, 76%. And that is significant because it is both prime ag land, where your vegetables are being grown, but it is also cattle land, an important component you'll hear more about later on from one of the other speakers. I'd also like to say that our biggest concern in the counties like ours, we are right in the Silicon Valley. We're at the bottom of the Silicon Valley and have significant pressures for development because we have lower land prices than Monterey County, than Santa Clara County, than Santa Cruz County, and we house a lot of those counties' workers, meaning the law enforcement officers, the teachers. They live in San Benito County and commute out to other communities. That means we have huge pressures, and I'll give you an example. Last year, we spent months and months and months beginning to process a 6,800 unit development for housing. That would have been 20,000 new bodies in our county, and our total county population right now is only 60,000. That's the kind of pressure we have. I will tell you that development has been withdrawn for economic reasons, but we are in the midst of one right now that's 1,100 units. And again, this is a very significant adjacent land that is agricultural production land, and so it is real, and if we don't have this tool in our toolbox, we're going to have a real tough time with good land use policy and planning going forward. So
thank you very much.
Let's
see if there are any questions. Any questions, Ms. Keogh? All right, Mr.
Thank you.
Ms. Walk, Mr. Price, Senator Onnested.
My total budget of the county, $100 million, but that includes all of the welfare. If you're talking about just our county general fund, $35 million. Williamson Act is $787,000 of that.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. James, you are the cleanup hitter here. Thank you. And you have a little bit of time left, but it's precious.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. My name's Ted James. I'm the Kern County Planning Director. Kern County, the home of Assemblymember Williamson, the author of the Williamson Act. And I'm also here in addition
not to speak of Senator Ashburn.
And certainly Senator Ashburn is very important to Kern County as well.
Just be sure we get that in there.
But in addition to being here on behalf of CSAC, I am here on behalf of the California County Planning Directors as well. And I'm here to send a strong message about the importance of the Williamson Act program. As an administrator of a particularly large program, again, we're second to Fresno County, but we do have a large, significant program. And also as being a land use planner, I want to give you some insights on the importance of this program to planners throughout the state and how they're dealing with urban growth issues. Our program, it's 1.7 million acres. It's a lot of property. Most of it is in Williamson Act. Areas in the fringes are farmland security areas. You'll note in my presentation I've included a map, and you'll notice this large contiguous blob of green area. And that's the importance of this program. This program helps keep farmers in business, as you've heard in previous testimony, but it also has been beneficial in my ability to prevent leapfrog development, prevent people from coming in, which I get all the time. I have people coming in, they have land and say, I want to develop that land. Tell me why I can't go before the Board of Supervisors and submit an application and ask to do that. And I get a lot of requests at the staff level where we discourage people because it's surrounded by Williamson Act property. We will have trouble making the findings for cancellation of this property. We do that on a daily basis, and that's the on-the-ground effectiveness of this program, is our ability to discourage people from going through the process. And I'll give you some of my board's philosophy in just a minute related to this program. Again, the Williamson Act program's purpose is to preserve farmland. It's important for the state economy, but it's also to discourage premature development and provide for orderly development. In my arsenal of tools to deal with planning, you can say I have a general plan and zoning, but I think your committee is aware that a general plan and zoning is only as good as the ability of the decision makers to back it up and hold to it. And in challenging economic times, that becomes more and more of a challenge. And we want to promote economic growth. It's important for my county, but we wanted to make sure it's done in an orderly, logical way as we deal with it. It's the fact that we have a program that's run locally. We work very closely with the State Department of Conservation, so there's that important partnership you heard the other two speakers talk about. But it's the contractual obligation where they have to keep their land in open space use that's important to me as a planning tool. I can use that and incorporate policies, which I have in our general plan, that say lands under Williamson Act contract need to be preserved. And the contracts plus direct policy prohibitions help to encourage the preservation of agricultural land and help to minimize the urbanization pressures that we have related to it. I think, we have naysayers that always say, yeah, but fine, the contracts are either 10 years for the Williamson Act program or 20 years for the Farmland Security Program. Those are just short term, and people can come in and go through and cancel those properties. My response to that is I have property owners, many property owners, who've been in this program for over 4 decades. They haven't gotten out of the program. They recognize, they like the incentive of having a reduced property tax, but they certainly see the value of having their land in that, and it helps me in discouraging people from coming in and proposing leapfrog development proposals. The Williamson Act program, it does have a close relationship with our general planning program. It is one of the many tools that I use, but believe it or not, it has more teeth for me because it's a locally popular program, because it has a contractual obligation, and because that contractual obligation is self-renewing each year, so that at all times there's a 10-year contract or a 20-year contract going on that property, that helps to discourage the farmers from coming in and asking for an immediate cancellation. We do not support immediate cancellations. There are some jurisdictions that do, but we don't, and we work very closely with the State Department of Conservation in looking at those cancellation findings to make sure we're not doing something that's premature in addressing issues. A couple other points I just want to touch on briefly. There are other tools that I use on a daily basis in my land use planning arena. CEQA, we use the Williamson Act program as an environmental effect. We are required under CEQA to institute all feasible mitigation. In Kern County, even in the city of Bakersfield, we are using one-to-one mitigation requirement when prime farmland is removed from, for urbanization purposes. So we are trying to use the Williamson Act with other tools to deal with the ag conversion issue. Subdivision Map Act provides provisions, and the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg LAFCO-related legislation does as well. And again, we recently had an item, unincorporated Williamson Act contract property, go before our LAFCO. City of Bakersfield supported approval of urban development on that property, and it was denied by the LAFCO board. Why? Because there were other Williamson Act contract properties right next door. They were concerned about the precedent-setting effect of canceling one and what it would do for others. So again, these are important tools for me that I use. And I want to just give you a couple of observations about the attractiveness of this program. Number one, you'll see my testimony. This is important for addressing the climate change legislation. We need the state to help local governments in dealing with that. Keeping land under Williamson Act, productive farmland, which grows green stuff, helps absorb CO2. We need to be focusing on more of that in California right now to help us meet our climate change goals. The other thing is the attractiveness of this program to the property owners I deal with. They like a local program. They think government is more responsive when it's closer to the people being served. The Williamson Act program does that. It's voluntary. And there's pros and cons about the voluntary nature, but it does have a self-renewing contract term to it. It's a locally run program. They can come right in to see us if they have issues about the program administration, and we're working in partnership with the state. And we need the state to be partners in providing the counties subvention payments to help keep us involved in this program. I want to emphasize this point about partnership.
Would you begin to wind up, sir?
Yes, and that is, it's important that that we work together, local governments and state work together in dealing with these issues. Yes, there's a funding issue on behalf of the state, but the counties are making a substantial commitment to try to preserve farmland, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any questions of Mr. James? Ms. Keel? No, sir. Mr. Caballero? Ms. Wall? Mr. Price? Dr. Onestad? We want to thank the panel very much for your testimony this morning, and thank you for coming.
Senator Cox, if I might draw attention, we left this with each member.
Yes,
we
ma'am.
did a
Thank you. We all
presentation
received
to
one.
the
Thank
governor.
You. Thank you. Now, if we could have the second panel come up, if you would, please. That would be Mr. Leahy, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Endicott. Now, gentlemen, I'm going to do my best to keep you on track. It will be helpful if you were cooperative.
Can I, excuse me.
Thank you, Rose.
All right. Nice to meet you. Sorry, this is on the block. But it's a big state.
Who will be first? Mr. Leahy?
I believe so. I'm going to get up in a second to show you our map. There's a copy of this map in your packet.
You may very well not get a lot of support from behind you. So we will ask the sergeants to move it to the right, if you would, please.
Thank you. I am Brian Leahy. I am the Assistant Director in the Department of Conservation for what they call the Division of Land Resource Protection. It includes, besides the Williamson Act, just briefly, it includes a farmland mapping program, which has documented land use changes on approximately 49 million acres. Since its existence in 1982, it has documented the conversion.
Excuse me for just a moment. Ms. Yamada, would you like to join us on the podium?
Would you like it?
You are certainly welcome to come up. We will accord you exactly the same privileges of asking questions.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. So our farmland mapping program was created to really settle the argument that there is a lot of conversion of farmland to other uses in the state. Since its existence, it has documented 1.25 million acres of conversion from agriculture to other uses. We have a farmland conservancy program that works on permanent easements and also helping to build the local land trust communities in the state. We have a watershed resource conservation district program that really helps locals to meet land use changes that really address water. Water is really, as you know, a local issue. So all of these programs are really based at the state being able to provide technical information, grants, tax benefits to locals who are trying to address what are really statewide issues. And that's the beauty of the Williamson Act. They're all volunteer programs. I jokingly call myself the good humor man of state government because basically we are handing out benefits to locals to address statewide issues. My own personal background is I was a farmer in Butte County. I had about 900 acres under Williamson Act contract, and I really learned, as a local use, that it's very effective. Besides helping provide good tax relief, especially during the depression that agriculture goes through every once in a while in the early 80s, those fixed rates were really helpful. But also when I wanted to do a land use that was not really appropriate in an agricultural area, because I was under contract, I had to go before my local land use committee, and they were able to tell me that that was not appropriate because it came from my peers. It was more receptive than, say, if it had come from the state. So anyways, what I'd like to do briefly is go through our map, and this map is in your packet. Because I'm colorblind, my mappers have made it kind of gross colors, but I can go through it quickly. And will you be able to hear me without?
Probably not. That's the basic problem that you have.
Then maybe I'll walk you through it. California is approximately 100 million acres. Half of it is private. Half of it's private, but half of it is public lands. This big yellow swath that you see, that is land that is under Williamson Act contract, and it's primarily our grazing lands. And as you know, this grazing land, it's incredible wildlife habitat corridors. In addition to providing food, it also provides groundwater and watershed management. There are many, many ecosystem services that are really provided by this land in addition to food. As you get into the Central Valley in the green, that is all contracted land that is considered prime. And that's our irrigated land. And, like I said, I farmed here in California. I also farmed in the Midwest, and I've pretty much seen agriculture throughout the world. This is a very unique place on the planet. And it's also, most of where our green is here in the Central Valley, it's where we're going to see a lot of urban pressures in the next 40 years. Originally, I'm fourth generation Los Angeles, and for many, many years, for 60 years, Los Angeles County was the largest ag production county in the nation. I remember my last cousin to farm said he simply had to leave. There was no longer the infrastructure to make it possible. So I truly believe, and I think most of us do, that if, say, Southern California and Orange County had really, North County is in Orange County, but if we had preserved large swaths of land that provide critical food and all the other ecosystem services, that it would, it would be a more livable place. And it really meets many, many of the needs of the state by doing so. So I don't want to take up other people's time, but as you can see, there's not a lot of land left. If you take out tribal land and this other stuff is timber, production, harvest stuff, that we have a lot of different uses we have to figure out, but production of food being one. So I truly believe this program has been very effective for many ways, but it is a local program. The state's role is interesting. We're kind of an oversight, and we're also the excuse. If Ted James really doesn't want to do something, he can say it's my fault, and it does sometimes help. Solar, it's been interesting with solar. There's been a lot of decisions being made. San Benito County's looking at a pretty amazing solar project because the Williamson Act has allowed grazing to stay intact. We can now use some of that land for other uses that the Act, in the Constitution sort of intended. So, and I have to say, without without this tax, without the constitutional ability to look at taxes differently, because it's the highest and best use. Well, some of us feel that the production of food and protection of ecosystem services is the highest and best use, but it's not economically if you're a county assessor. But the Constitution has changed, so if you go under this restrictive agreement, you actually do receive how much you can produce off of that land. So I think it's a very important this program for that reason.
Mr. Leahy, Senator Onnested has a question for you.
Yes.
I want to take you up on the offer to say that it's your fault.
Uh-oh.
Because you're the only administration representative we have here today.
No, sir. No.
And I know that the name of this conference today is Past, Present, and Future. The past has showed me a program, which in my opinion is a state program that has been successful for decades. If it ain't broke, you don't fix it. I'm not so interested in what we're going to do in the future. I'll leave that to the others as far as changing the actual Williamson Act or coming to version 2.0. But I am very much concerned about the present. I don't agree with your statement that this is a local program. I believe that when the Williamson Act was passed, the intent of the legislator, Mr. Williamson, and the legislature was that it was going to be a partnership. $38 million in a $20 billion budget deficit is budget dust. And yet the importance I see today, the value of the testimony so far, is how important this is to local government, and the state is not holding up its end of the bargain. Now, I know it's not you.
Thank you.
The buck stops on the first floor here.
Don't let him get off so easy.
I'm not letting you get off. I'm not going to let you get off. But what I'm asking you, last year we tried to negotiate to get the funding back for the Williamson Act. We're going to do everything we can this year to do the same. Not necessarily changing it, but if this committee wants to go in that direction, maybe that's something that needs to be looked at. But the immediate need right now for my 12 rural counties is to get the state to shoulder up to its responsibility of a 40-year-old program that has worked very successfully. And you can't just leave the locals in the lurch. What, in your opinion, as the administration's representative here today, is the likelihood of our getting back the $38 million in Williamson Act subventions to the rural counties in this year's budget now?
Senator Annenstead, that's a very hard question for me to answer. I do know that the reason given for the elimination of subvention payments was that the budget was in dire straits, and it doesn't look like it's much better this next year. So I don't see any reason why that logic would change. But
are you here today then representing the administration in the capacity of just giving us information, which basically we don't need? What we need is hope, and what we need is from a Department of Conservation who understands the importance of the administration. Are you going to the governor? Are you going to his people and saying, we've got to put this program back?
I do use the channels that, if you work for the state, you go through channels. And so we have expressed that this is an important program. But I'm an appointee. It's very interesting to come into the state at 50 and see how things work. I just probably said too much there. We have expressed that we believe this is a very important program. And I've never seen a message that is not the way it's considered. Many views, I tell you, as you know, there are economists who believe that we should produce our food in Ecuador, which I worked in Ecuador, and I'm not an economist. My pay grade is here.
Understand. I think if you do go back and you talk to your superiors and you ever get to talk to the governor himself, I hope you'll convey the message that this legislature is adamant that this is a program that needs to be restored.
I hear you very well.
Thank you.
Ms. Yamada, do you have any questions all right. How about to Ms. Keogh, any questions? Ms. Caballero? Ms. Wolk?
Yes, I do. And I would like to ask...
Now, you know you've got the administration treed here now, so be gentle.
I liked everything you said, Senator Onestad, but we have fought this battle, and we have fought this battle for the last 6 years, 5 years. Clearly, the administration doesn't share our belief in the value of the Williamson Act. I want to ask you to put your hat aside for a moment and just take your experience as having been the administrator of this program and others in terms of conservation. And are there any other funding sources that you think might work? Again, they are not being, proposed by the administration, but that you think might make sense. For example, cancellation fee revenues, if they were earmarked as a partial source of funding for county subventions or something like that. Have you thought about any other areas?
I believe in the next session of testimony, some of those individuals will address that. There's beginning of a good coalition of people that benefit from the Williamson Act starting to look at how would we get something off the general fund and right. More fee-based. So I think that's a better question for Bill Geyer and for some of the other, John Gamper and whatnot.
Okay. Then let me ask you a question directly about the current Williamson Act. While I support the program strongly and have fought for it, I do think that there are areas that people raise questions about, members of the legislature raised questions about, that may make it a better act. Are there areas that you think need to be improved, either in the original, in the notion of compatible uses, or how it's been administered in ways that would really tighten up certain areas of enforcement, for example, at the local level?
I think
any thoughts on that?
That's been really very interesting to see in the past 3 years. And I do think there are places where we could tighten up the act. This state is remarkably diverse in its agriculture. And what makes sense in San Benito County, in the Salinas Valley, is very different than Imperial County or where I farm in Butte County. But I think it is time to really look at it. The question I always ask myself is, the people of California are willing to give the landowner a lower tax rate, something, in exchange for what they believe is some benefits. So it's real important to clearly identify what benefits is that landowner providing the people of California in exchange for that alternative tax structure.
Okay. And then my last question has to do with water transfers. Is there any? Come back. With respect to Williamson Act lands, are there any regulations that govern transfers of water off those lands, either temporarily or permanent?
No, we have looked at that issue, and it's not really our place to comment unless they are taking. The Act says that the contract you sign is for mostly agricultural production. So if someone is willing to take irrigated land and take their water rights and sell them off to somewhere else, but they're going to convert it to agricultural land, then they're still within the confines of the Act. So it would not be appropriate for us to comment on that. But if they were willing to take that water off and then take it out of production, right, and then that becomes an event, especially if it's 100 acres or more, where we have CEQA commenting rights, and we can challenge that, or we can write letters that question that.
But there is no restriction to doing that, to a permanent transfer, for example, that would change the agricultural nature of that land.
Yeah, no, there's not. There is not.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Any other questions, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Price, Mr. Thompson? Good morning, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I'm Ed Thompson. I'm California Director for American Farmland Trust. We're a 30-year-old organization that I believe is really the only one in the country dedicated specifically to protecting land for food production. I've personally been involved with AFT since it started and with California Farmland for nearly as long, the last 6 years as our state director. In the brief time that I have, I'd like to make 3 points for you and elaborate on each one of them. First of all, Williamson Act is a bargain, and it ought to be fully funded. Second of all, Williamson only goes so far and really needs to be improved, and there are lots of ideas for doing that going forward. Third, we need to go beyond that considerably to really do the job that is necessary to save the #1 agriculture in this country. So let me come back to each one of those. My organization's done study after study around this country that shows that if there's one land use that pays more in revenue than it costs in public service, it is agriculture by a factor of 3 or 4 to 1. And therefore, the small amount of tax relief that we are granting through Williamson pales in comparison to the economic benefits that we receive from agriculture, even if you only look at taxes versus local public services. So it is indeed a bargain, and the case for keeping it on that grounds alone is pretty strong. Secondly, we need to take a look at Williamson going forward to see what 2.0 might look like. The tax relief that it now offers seems to be more important to ranchers than it does to crop farmers. The ranchers tend to own more land, and they earn less per acre. So naturally, you'd assume that this would be of greater value to them. And this seems to be reflected in the pattern of Williamson Act enrollment. You're taking a 30,000-foot view here on this map, but when you zoom down into it, what you find is that within 5 miles of just about any given city, the pattern of enrollment is pretty spotty. So it raises questions about whether the incentives that Williamson is offering really are sufficient to create the kind of contiguous large blocks of agricultural land that the industry needs to prevent sprawl, to prevent conflicts with urban uses, and ultimately to thrive. California is only one of 49 states in the union that has this sort of use value taxation as an incentive to landowners. And I think we can look at some of these other states for other examples of approaches that are taking that we might consider going forward. 3 that I want to bring to your attention are New York, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all of which offer a state income tax credit to agricultural landowners that helps offset their property taxes. They're called circuit breakers, and they tend to kick in when property taxes exceed a certain percentage of the operation's income. Needless to say, they're fairly popular with local government, which doesn't see the money come out of their coffers, and they don't have to fight every year about whether the subvention payments are in fact going to be there or not. Like Williamson, these programs require landowners to make a commitment 8 to 10 years to keep land in agriculture. There's a renewing provision similar to Williamson, and there's also a capture rollback when the land is converted, similar to Williamson. Now, what's interesting about some of these is, I'll just point out a couple things. In New York, you can't just enroll as an individual landowner. You have to be part of what they call an agricultural district, and it has to be 500 acres. That may not sound like a lot here in California, but in New York, it's huge. The average farm's 120 some acres, so you can't do it by yourself. And the theory here is that when farms are all protected against development, they act as a buffer against each other, help prevent the encroachment of development rather than being isolated parcels. So New York requires you to get into one of these agricultural districts, offers these tax incentives, and the result has been that there's some 400 districts in New York averaging 20,000 acres apiece. So they really have achieved these large contiguous blocks rather than something that looks a little more like Swiss cheese. Wisconsin's program is even more interesting. There, to qualify, again, it's not a matter of individual. I mean, there are voluntary, but either your land has to be in an exclusive agricultural zone where non-farm uses are for the most part forbidden, again, to protect agriculture, or the county has to have adopted a strong farmland preservation plan, similar to what you could find in agricultural elements of general plans here. those provisions kicked in only after 5 years when they started this in the late 70s. Up until that time, you could enroll individually. But after that 5-year period, if the county didn't do one of these two things, the tax credit disappeared. If it did, the tax credit increased significantly. So what you found in Wisconsin is the phenomenon of the agricultural community marching down to the county courthouse and saying, hey, we want an agricultural plan and the policy to back it up so we can qualify for this. And it's been highly successful. 70 of the 72 counties in Wisconsin are participating in this, and millions of acres comprising more than half of their farmland are enrolled in this. So those are some of the things you might want to look at going forward that offer additional benefits to landowners and to local government and might help improve Williamson. Let me conclude by just offering a few other ideas about how we might go beyond Williamson. One of them is to increase the investment in Brian Leahy's California Farmland Conservancy program. This is the one that pays landowners for conservation easements that are permanent, although there's a kick-out clause if things change. They've been pretty popular with landowners. But this state is invested a pittance compared with what other states have done in this kind of program. Here we've invested on average 11 cents per person per year since this program was started. In contrast, states like Maryland, Pennsylvania, Vermont, which lead the league in this, are investing $4 to $7 per person and have protected 10, 15 times as much land as California. So I would urge you to look at that. Second, and this may be the most important thing that we need to pay attention to, we need to increase the efficiency of development. And by that I mean the number of people we're accommodating for each acre of land, not just for houses, but for commercial and institutional development as well. In this state, since 1990, we have developed an acre of farmland for every 9 new residents. You think of 2 4-person touch football teams playing in the Rose Bowl with a referee, and that gives you an idea of how spread out that is. And that is what we're doing with this precious valley here and all the fabulous land we have here. Places here in Sacramento County, the Bay Area, Los Angeles are doing much better, 12 to 20 people per acre on average. And we're not talking high-rises here. We're talking traditional California-style development on a slightly more compact scale that not only conserves farmland, but it also saves energy, conserves water, and reduces greenhouse gases. So we need to encourage more efficient development through mechanisms like SB 375, but I think there are other ways we could do that too. Now, finally, let me just say that one of the biggest holes, I think, in what's going on in farmland here is the lack of a clear, explicit, and firm policy of this state that we do want to protect the land for agriculture. Yes, Williamson the preamble has some good language about how important farmland is, as does CEQA. There's a law called AB 857, passed in 2003, that establishes farmland preservation and efficient development as 2 of the state's planning goals, but there has never been a farmland preservation goal set in the state. And I would submit to you that that is one of the things that underlies our difficulty here. So what we continue to do is lose 75 square miles of farmland each and every year and hope that agriculture can continue to make up through increases in productivity that had depend largely on fossil inputs, on abundant water, and on technologies that the public right now is questioning for better or for worse.
Mr. Thompson, your time is about expired, so could you...
And so has my talk. I appreciate your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Let's see if there are any questions for you, Mr. Thompson. Ms. Carriero? Ms. Wolf?
Just would like a little clarification on the requirements that are, what is required for the tax credits, and we could talk about Wisconsin. You did mention the requirement to do an agricultural element, essentially. But is the credit available to anyone, to any grower, regardless of income level? Are there any thresholds at all?
Wisconsin and New York are circuit breaker programs that I mentioned. That is to say, If your property taxes reach a certain level, then the income tax credit kicks in. So they offset a significant portion of local property taxes, but without having it come out of local coffers. It's borne by the state taxpayers, just as subvention payments are here. And in doing that, what they're doing is targeting the relief to those who need it most, while at the same time keeping the cost down to the taxpayers.
Any other questions as well?
No, thank you.
Mr. Price.
Senator, if I may.
Yes, but let me just go around. Senator Onestad, Ms. Yamada.
Thank you very much, Senator, and thank you for graciously welcoming me to this hearing. A couple of questions. You mentioned New York, Wisconsin, and Michigan as kind of the lead in the nation on these alternatives to our Williamson Act. Are those states on record as establishing farmland preservation as a goal, as you noted, that California should do?
Very much so. In fact, in each of those states, the governor has, at one point or another, commissioned a panel to look into exactly what the policy should be.
Levels.
So they've, there are many states, and California is a leader in a lot of things, but this is not one of them.
And just a quick follow-up question. Secretary Vilsack, of course, of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, have you, in your travels, noted any conversations at that level about establishing farmland preservation as a national security goal almost?
Well, as a matter of fact, there was a law passed in 1981 called the Farmland Protection Policy Act that is an official U.S. policy in favor of protecting farmland. And it functions much like CEQA, requiring federal agencies to look at alternatives to reduce the loss of land. Now, I will say that the administration of that law has been a little up and down, depending on who happens to be in the White House at the time. So we are hopeful and working on Secretary Vilsack to make a more robust effort of that as we speak.
Any additional questions, Mr. Yamada? Mr. Endicott, you are next, sir.
Okay, and I see you want to get back to 10:30, so I'll try to talk backwards as fast as I can.
I'm glad you got that. Thank you for your testimony. Appreciate your coming today.
So I've ripped everything to shreds, and I've got handwritten notes here, but I'll try and make it very concise and cut to the chase. But I did want to emphasize the way the Williamson Act fits in with us, because we do actually have both hunters and farmers as members of the Sierra Club who care a lot about this, and I've been doing a lot of polling, actually, in the upcoming week since this hearing was announced. And we look at it from the point of view of sustainable communities. And while this is a conservation program, as Mr. Detweiler said, we are into a preservation aspect of this, which is the preserving of sustainability. And conservation programs that maintain the characteristics that keep us within the carrying capacity of the environment are important to the Sierra Club. And we also believe it's an important part of the social fabric and ecologic fabric. But I'll leave that to the social fabric to the people that follow me. I want to thank, though, Senator Woke, though, for your question about water transfer off of these lands, because they are an inherent part of the value of this program to sustainability. Ag lands, as you know, provide a variety of important functions besides just putting food in our mouths. And it is important, one of the aspects of Williamson Act that I want to emphasize is that it eases pressure that can easily spiral out of control, particularly on the map. It doesn't show it as prime land, but in the coastal areas where we have small farms, but they are significant corridors often for wildlife. And they also preserve view sheds and are part of the social fabric of our coastal communities that are important to maintain. And if you start rolling this, the ball starts rolling, it can accelerate quickly. And that's very problematic in areas like our coastal areas. We also look at this as being very important because these agricultural lands provide ecosystem services for water and air filtration has been mentioned, floodplains allowing floodwaters in necessary times to spread out rather than channelization, and could be very important groundwater recharge basins. So that needs to be part of it. Climate change, this can be helpful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for sequestration, but of course the type of farming practices are very important as to how big a role these kinds of lands can play in that. And then also how the lands are managed, either as cattle areas or agricultural areas, their nature of their value as a refugia or a wildlife corridor can be affected. So we like to see that these things are considered in fact, not just in policy. We recognize that there's an extremely tough budget forecast in the near term. Senator Onestad, but we think it is important to maintain the environmental program infrastructure, as it were, so that it can be rebuilt as quickly as possible. And this is a state program with a local nexus or a local lead on it, but the state has a critical role to play in this. Some 2.0 thoughts. We thank you for letting us be here today. We want to participate in any changes that you're contemplating to the Act as it goes forward, although we are interested in preserving the Act as it sits right now. The benefits of the Williamson Act is relatively simple to carry out and relatively simple to enforce between the good local guys and the bad state-level guys who can review things. And you've heard about how it integrates with CEQA and with other programs as well as wildlife conservation programs, et cetera. I won't stay in that. But the role for the state is important, and it does have one to play. As the program is restructured, and I'm an optimistic person that it will be, just like the rain is coming down and solving our water supply issue for today. I don't really mean that. But, and I don't want to propose that we start trying to pick and choose or complicate the Williamson Act. But as we rebuild it, and the state has a role in here if it's going to continue participating in subventions, is some focus or prioritization may be in order. And that's paying attention to certain things like where prime soils are, what's the nature of are we making sure that we are incorporating groundwater recharge basins in all areas of the state. What's its role and potential in flood protection and avoiding channelization, and then also maybe emphasizing in some ways that you get priority if you're willing to go into longer periods of time, maybe 20 years rather than going into a farmland security zone or joining a farmland security zone, or just committing to a longer period of time should get priority, or that if you're doing extra over and above habitat protection or encouragement on your farmlands might merit some bonus. We also want to help, from our point of view, sustainable and organic farmers who are leading the way in new technologies to reduce the amount of pesticides we have to do on the land and changing some of the practices. So in our polling, though, cutting quickly to 2.0 and some other suggestions about funding. Our members had some concerns about the income tax because we think it could change the nature of the programs in ways that are unanticipated if we're not careful. We want to for many farmers, large profits margins do not seem to be their biggest problem. The property tax is a good nexus with the issues that they face in development. We want to be careful not to be creating hobbyist farmers as opposed to those that actually contribute to local food supplies. Now, for potential funding sources, I know this will get Senator Onestad's joy up, but there is the oil severance tax that we're pushing, which would not encourage new oil development, but put a tax on existing offshore oil development and onshore development for natural gas and oil. Also, some states have looked at property transfer taxes, including the state of Florida, which I'll submit more information on later, as something to be considered. And I thank you for inviting us to the table. I'll call one report to your attention, which I'll supply the website and stuff in our testimony, but is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report. And what's good about that is it really does emphasize that humans' well-being, as well as animals' well-being, is greatly tied to how we maintain a sustainable environment, and agriculture is certainly an important part of that. Thank you.
Mr. Endicott, thank you very much. Let's see if there are any questions for you. Ms. Caballero?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you explain a little bit more your concern about the income tax? You were speaking really quickly, and I may have missed what the concern is in regards to maybe shifting to an income tax. Number one, and number two, why do you care if there are, or why would you care if people are becoming boutique growers, or as long as it's an open space and it achieves the goals that we're trying to set? Why would you? And I don't mean why would you care, but what's the concern you have?
I don't want to reject the idea out of hand, but I think Ed pointed out these programs have other components to them that the Williamson Act doesn't have that are critical in determining where the source of the funding is and how it's directed. It's not just because they're boutique, and I was just using a fast phrase to try and save time, move backwards on the clock. But what we do care about for local farmers and local communities in these spaces that are in the last valuable wildlife corridors, or the runoff as we try to control floodwaters from rushing downstream, and we use green development to kind of trap water just naturally using the filtration systems, that if you're a boutique farmer, let's continue to use the offensive phrase, a boutique farmer, you might have different interests, and your property might not be developed in the same way as a person who's doing general farming. And I don't want to try and change the nature of it, but when a person who can use an income tax is in a different bracket than another person who can't use the income tax break. So you have to see whether that has a regressivity in it or not, but I don't want tied in. There's keys to this program that Ed can address. It's just something I was trying to signal that we should pay attention to.
All right, Mr. Price.
Just quickly, you mentioned how prioritization might change. Emphasis around a bit. You talked about giving credit for longer periods of time. Thank you. Is that something that's been successful in other states, or it's kind of a blue sky possibility, or what's the...
No, I think one of the proofs that the Williamson Act is actually a good act is that people do renew. That there are many families that actually are trying to stay in that social fabric and trying to keep that land and not sell it off. And sometimes, fathers feel their sons who have been educated and gone off elsewhere don't have the right attitude, but they want to keep the land together for their sons and relatives and cousins that do want to keep trying to farm. So that is one piece of it. So for the longer term. So yes, it is successful, and in the length of this term, it is successful. What is unique about, and the reason for that planning, is it also shows a commitment on both sides, local government and the property owner, to keeping the area generally in that setting. If you have lots of people developing right around the area, or say I'm trying to hold it here, but all the people around me are ready to jump out in the given year, it makes it harder for me to resist jumping out. And, so the more stability, the better. And that was just as a way of saying that as we're building something, we're not going to have unlimited resources in the near term, or in the longer term. Some people can survive that period better than others. But I think the key thing is that the natural functions are important to know about. And we have been doing some studies and overlays of areas to show these are the characteristics of these areas generally. And then we want to look at the development patterns to see, are we really just preserving little isolated islands that aren't very functional, or are we actually keeping big pockets together? Sometimes a big pocket in the Central Valley is much bigger than a big pocket would be defined in the coast down by, say, Santa Cruz. But that big pocket is relative to what's happening around it.
Senator Arnstead, any questions? Yamada? Gentlemen, thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now take the third panel.
Thank you.
If we could ask Paul Winger, who's president of the California Farm Bureau, as well as Jack Hansen, who's the treasurer of the California Cattlemen's Association, along with William Geyer, who's the executive director of the Resource Landowners Coalition. Gentlemen, don't worry about the clock. We have plenty of time. Thank you. Well, not exactly. But we want you to feel comfortable, and we want you to make your presentation. And we'll go from there. Who will be first?
I guess I got elected.
And your name is Paul Winger?
Paul Winger. Good morning. Yeah, my name is Paul Winger. I'm a third-generation farmer from Modesto and currently serve as the president of the California Farm Bureau. Thank you for bringing up this important topic here this morning. I also would like to say we have our written comments are different. They're going to be what my comments are going to be right here. Nothing is certain but death and taxes. I think we've all known that phrase. The only uncertain part of it is when and how much. Two issues that have become a great concern to our members. I get phone calls every day is about the estate taxes. As you know, that in 2010 there is no estate tax. 2011 it's going to probably rear its ugly head and come back. The Williamson Act, will it remain in force? Those are the two issues that I get called about a lot. Ironically, both the estate tax and the Williamson Act are interrelated. The estate tax can contribute to the premature and otherwise undesired parcelization and development of ag property, land that is valued at its appraisal rate higher than what it can produce for its ag value. Prior to the Williamson Act, landowners were taxed based on appraisals that did not reflect their ag production enterprises. Prop 13 did lock in values for those who have owned their land prior to 1978, but many of us have bought land since that time. Even for myself, we've had the land that we have farmed for 20 years for neighbors, and they want to sell it to us, have sold it to us at values that are far higher than what their ag production value is. Luckily, we've been able to buy some of that at less than a speculative value, but however, if the Williamson Act and all those lands are in the Williamson Act, we would not be able to pay the taxes. And I know when I tell folks that we wouldn't be able to pay the property tax, yeah, we could pay the property tax, but when it costs $10,000 to $15,000, upwards of $20,000 for some crops to plant a crop, not counting your mortgages on your ag land, to be able to retire that debt on that land, your development costs, as well as your production costs. You know, you do this because it's an occupation and you hope to have a little return on investment. And a lot of times that return will be eaten up in that property tax you'd have to pay if you had to pay it based on its appraised value. One of the main and common influences that are affecting both the estate tax and our property tax values is a 1031 exchange. The 1031 exchange has allowed prices to be driven up. We see a lot of folks have, at a time of an estate tax, valuation because neighbors' property have sold out. The people have done a 1031 exchange. They have had a sale forgone. The taxes on that sale, as long as they can buy the neighbor's ag land. And so that drives the valuation up. You look at like values, and it drives the value up. If the Williamson Act was to go away, there would be an increased pressure to sell land for development. The pressure to sell to land speculators would also contribute. We heard something earlier about selling your water. It's interesting that we had a lot of bad press when a quote-unquote farmer sold his water for $70 million. And yet the farmer was not actually a farmer, but somebody who owned farm land as an investment. We have also seen rangeland that has been sold by people that want to use it just strictly for recreation, which creates a lot of other problems like fire control and whatnot when they do not allow grazing on that land because they aren't cattlemen. Land should be taxed based on its income-producing value. When you think about the fact that whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a taxi cab driver, or a legislator, maybe we should have income taxes based on what you could really be making or should be making, but no, you're taxed on what you are making. And yet, in property tax, a lot of times they want to base it on its appraised value and what somebody else thinks it should be able to pay. For the certainty of paying a tax based on what the income producing value is of your land, growers sign a 10-year contract that they will not develop their land. The Williamson Act has, over the last since its inception, it has prevented the parcelation of ag land as evidenced by the fact that 14.5 million acres have been protected for at least 35 years. It has contributed to the fact that California agriculture has become the 5th largest ag economy in the world. If you take Texas and Iowa and combine them as a state, they would still be number 2 to California. It has helped keep the family on the farm, an actual farm land owner, which I think is very important in who we represent at the California Farm Bureau. At a time when we are looking for state and national economic stimulus in our economy, as well as a safe, reliable, affordable food supply for our populace, it is ironic that the Williamson Act would be under attack when it is so intricately responsible for the success of California agriculture and the California gross domestic product for all of our population. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the members?
Yes.
Senator Wolk.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning.
Morning.
I wanted to ask you just a couple very specific questions. We have a number of issues involving what is compatible use in the Williamson Act, and I'm curious as to, there are some suggestions that solar, wind, other uses be permitted. Do you have any reaction to that?
We've looked at these. I think it depends if it takes away the ag producing value. This is an open space and conservation, and I think there are other ways for a lot of these other uses that they can pass those costs on, and so they have that ability where you don't have that in agriculture. If you're a cattleman, you don't know until your livestock make it to market what you're going to get for that. For a lot of these other uses, whether it's solar and whatnot, there's a lot of tax advantages for going into the solar. We'd have to look at the specific language, but I think you have to really look at what the Act is all about, and that's keeping the farm in ag production, keeping the land in ag production and open space.
Okay. And let me ask you about food processing facilities. We've had that conflict in YOLO in past years, and I'm just
Again, I think it's a relativity. I know working with Brian at the Department of Conservation, a lot of times we see for our membership vertical integration. You talk about locally grown food and locally processed food. And so I think there has to be some flexibility there. If the processing is an adjunct to whatever the farm is doing, and I'm not sure you can just make a carte blanche statement. It really, somebody has to look and make that determination. If you have a 40-acre vineyard and 35 acres are under concrete because it's for weddings and other things, is it really a vineyard? But if you have a 40-acre vineyard and they have a winery there and maybe they do a few weddings a year and have some other, then I think that's good. It's good for our folks that are in agriculture to have that interface with the consumer. So it's really degrees that you would have to look at. I'm not sure that you could just make a carte blanche statement on that. But again, as we see a lot of our folks see vertical integration, when you talk about locally grown food, locally processed food, I think we want to encourage that, make sure that it works to keep the family on the farm.
And just one last question about water transfers again. Certainly, water transfers have been extremely important to agriculture, intra-farm transfers. Do you have any feeling about restricting permanent transfers, which would result off Williamson Act land, that would result in the permanent fallowing change in the use of the land?
Yeah, I think that if you're going to permanently restrict the land, and you would have to look at that very closely. Part of the agreement is you aren't going to develop your land, and also I think if you take some of the rights, the water right to that land, and move it off that ground, then you've probably restricted the economic viability for agriculture of that land.
Thank you. Thanks.
Any additional questions? How about you, Dr. Anastad? Go ahead, Ms. Yamada.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Winger, it's good to see you. I want to particularly thank you again for coming out to both the Yolo and Solano County Farm Bureau events, I think where we first met. Yeah. I know you're getting out all over the state. What is your sense or barometer reading of the understanding of the Williamson Act with some of our urban counterparts? Because I know that, serving on the Agricultural Committee for the Assembly, there are sometimes less understanding from some of our colleagues in other parts of the state. So just a barometer reading, if you can.
Yeah, I think a lot of the urban folks don't really understand it until you can put it in terms that they do understand the fact that there's an appraised value involved here, and if you were to relate it to, say, Prop 13 and on their own homes, and you start looking at some people that retired in the 60s and they try to stay under their house for the 70s. If it hadn't been for Prop 13, they'd be taxed away from their homes if it hadn't been for Prop 13, especially when we saw the run-up in prices throughout the Central Valley in our area, which was some of the hardest hit areas. And so it's the same thing with ag land. I think everybody can understand taxation for a value of what the production is, not on appraised value. And so we have to be very careful. And once you explain it to our urban counterparts, they understand it. I'm just not sure it's a high priority, but you get to have the benefit of making those determinations for everybody. But I think people do understand that they want to keep the family on the farm. They would like to see the farmer be the farm owner, and the Williamson Act does help protect that.
All right. Supervisor Hanson, you're not here in that capacity today, but you're here as far as the Cattlemen's Association is concerned. I believe you're next, sir.
That is correct. Thank you very much, Senator Cox, and thank you, members of the committee, to allow us to speak before you on this very important topic. I'm going to be brief in my comments. There's an advantage to being near the end, if you will, because I can quickly back there in the audience change my statement to reflect my views, maybe opposing views on the other speakers. However, today, I must admit, I'd put dittos probably across most of them to include Mr. Endicott and the Sierra Club and so on. So we do definitely have common ground. I think it's been expressed here. But I'm going to digress and diverge a little bit from my prepared statement, which you have in front of you or was given to you earlier, and just kind of hit some of the highlights. Before I even get started in my presentation, I think that based on today's hearings and based on continued analysis of the Williamson Act, there are just a few givens, and I'm going to amplify on them, but I'll go ahead and list them very quickly if I could. One, I think the Act has been enormously successful. I don't think we'll get any argument on that. Without some sort of subvention, I would agree with Supervisor Case, I think its future is in doubt. I think the Williamson Act and the subvention payments are a bargain for the state of California. And I think that the value of Williamson Act land, based on its productivity or its production value, as opposed to possibly its highest and best use, if you will, it's not a subsidy or a free lunch. Each landowner gives something in return for that value received. And I think if the act and the contract disappear, more ag and open space lands will be converted to other uses. And I think if the act and the contracts disappear, some land and some producers will definitely exit the business. What those numbers are, I don't know. We'll leave it for the future to tell. Again, just as a matter of quick introduction, my name is Jack Hansen. I'm currently serving as treasurer of the California Cattlemen's Association. And my wife, Darcy, and our 2 sons and I own and operate a family cattle ranch in the high desert country of Lassen County. I've been actively involved in agriculture for 40 years and a contract holder since 1978. I also, as Senator Cox alluded to, I am serving my 2nd term as Lassen County Supervisor as well. The California Cattlemen's Association, obviously, as most of you know, is a nonprofit trade association, and we have the pleasure of representing ranchers and beef producers in the legislative and regulatory arenas, both on the federal and state level. Firstly, I'd like to compliment Mr. Detwilder and your staff on the white paper. I thought it was an excellent starting point, excellent history. And when it comes to history, I'm going to leave most of that to Mr. Geyer, obviously, and I think that'll save some time because I know Bill's been around it for a long time. So I'm not going to dwell on the history, and I'm not going to dwell on the success. 16 million acres, half the farmland, a third of the private land in the state of California speaks for itself. Again, one of my givens is that this is not a subsidy or a free lunch. As all the members know, in return for the use-based property tax, the landowner at a minimum gives up for the term of the contract, a 10 or a 20-year contract on a rolling basis. You give up certain property rights that would otherwise be available to that individual, that landholder, by right or by permit. In addition, in some counties, obviously, there's parcel merging that's done when you enter an ag preserve and other restrictions on the use of the property. I think probably the most important thing, again, I would reiterate the point that $39 million or whatever number we eventually put on the subvention funding for the state of California is a bargain. And I think that is the crux of the issue facing us today when we're looking at the Williamson Act. It's the money issue, I'm sorry to say. If the counties would turn around and honor the contracts in perpetuity without any subvention payments, we wouldn't be here having this discussion. Conversely, if the landowners would agree to honor their contracts and keep the land in agricultural production and open space without any financial incentive, obviously all would be well. But regrettably, neither one of these will be the case. Considering the county's financial conditions, my own county included, without subvention payments, it would be difficult. And I could reflect very quickly on my own county. There are 3 of us on a board of 5 who are actively involved. Our primary business is agriculture. Of that, 2 are contract holders, and obviously we have to recuse ourselves from any discussion of this matter when it comes to the county level. But even with a heavily influenced agricultural community and agricultural board, when you put on your supervisor's hat and you think about the well-being of all your constituents, as all of you do, it would be very difficult to continue the Williamson Act contracts in our county without the subvention payments. So I think that one point that Paul made a little bit earlier, and I just reiterate that point with a quick summary, the state budgets and the local budgets are all stressed, but I can assure you the ranchers and farmers budgets out there are stressed as well. And if we were to revert back to using the highest and best use for assessing our property taxes on the property, this would add to the financial stress that's already occurring out in the agricultural community. For all intents and purposes, I think we would all agree, and certainly the Cattlemen's Association would attest, that the Williamson Act has definitely not outlived its usefulness. It's well subscribed to, and as was indicated earlier, I can't remember, I apologize who indicated it, but most of the folks in the Act there have been very few non-renewals. There have been, relative to the total involvement in the Act, there have certainly been very few cancellations. I don't know the number of the acreage, but it's a minuscule amount. I think most have rolled, like our family, we've rolled that Act over for 32 years now, and happy to do so, and will continue to do so. In closing, we truly appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule to hold this hearing and entertain a frank discussion on the issue. We realize that the fact that you scheduled this hearing is testimony to the importance that you place on the Williamson Act. And I can assure you it's of critical importance to our members and the citizens of California as well. Our association and its members pledge to continue to work with the administration, the legislature, and our partners to explore all opportunities to strengthen the Williamson Act and thus ensure the continuation of its benefits for our children, our grandchildren, and the citizens of the state of California. And very quickly, I would like to thank Senator Onestad for his comment to Mr. Leahy. Obviously, we appreciate that, because I think that's where the issue lies.
Thank you very much. Let me just let me ask the question that was asked earlier. I'd like to get your opinion on this, Jack. You talked about the highest and best use, but as a rancher, should we be treating grazing land differently than cropland and open space? Or is that the highest and best use?
For most of that property, if it remains in agriculture, Senator, that would be the highest and best use. If we're talking about switching from one crop to another, again, I wouldn't necessarily discourage that, but that would all remain under the purview of the Act. What I was referring to, obviously, is if the highest and best use during the assessment process were determined to be some sort of development, and so you were taxed, as Mr. Wenger said, on the speculative value of the property.
Got it.
That's where the issue would be critical.
All right. Let's see if there are any questions for Mr. Hanson. Any, Ms. Wall? Dr. Onestad? Ms. Yamada?
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Mr. Geyer, you're next. I remember maybe a couple of years ago you were here. We were talking about someone up in the North counties that were subdividing Williamson Act property for whatever reason.
Well, that was the case. That case has been up to the appellate court system and back, and basically the county won the argument at the appellate level, and it's on remand at the local level. So the litigation is, as I understand,
still continues.
It's still going on.
Didn't mean to get you off track, sir.
No. As most of you, first, before I introduce myself, I need to say, chair, consultant, members of the committee, and members not of the committee, I am very impressed with the development of this hearing, the way the hearing's been run. Sometimes when you're batting last, you're at risk of having an audience that consists of the chair, a secretary, and a sergeant at arms. And I think you've all really asked good questions and participated in this. And
Mr. Geyer, those are guards at the door. They're not letting people out. You just need to know that.
So anyway, I just wanted to give my personal kudos to the way in which this is developed and the interest that the members of both houses have shown in this issue. As most of you know, back in the 1960s, I was a consultant to the Committee on Agriculture in the Assembly. I worked with John Williamson in the development of the Williamson Act, and then as a two-for, after I was actually out of the legislature, the legislative staff, I was hired back by John, who was then the chair of the Joint Committee on Open Space Lands, to develop a subvention program on the hope that there would be an opportunity to put it in the law, which suddenly came within 10 days at the end of 1971 when Governor Reagan's feet the concrete around his feet cracked with regard to his opposition to state income tax withholding, and lo and behold, there was $13 million of additional revenue that the governor and the legislature had agreed as part of that deal to invest in the Williamson Act subvention program. And I have to thank a guy who I hired, who many of you know, Dean Mazinski, who was for years the head of the Legislative Research Bureau, for crunching the numbers on those big mainframe computers and spindle cards and so forth. And they said we had $13 million, and Dean Mazinski brought in a kind of complicated program right on the $13 million number in the first year, and where we're off and running. And at that time, the general fund was an appropriate and available source of funding for subventions, and has been so without question for more than 30-some years since. However, I have to say that after the failure, I think the legislature, various people rescued the subventions out of the general fund like 3 times last year, and then three times they slipped out, ultimately in a veto. It left at least me, and I think other members of our coalition, our 3-part coalition, environmentalists, county officials, and landowners, having to ask a hard question about, is the general fund, given all of the additional stresses and strains that are being put on it, is it a long-term viable source of funding for a program that has to have a credible source of funding in order to work? You can't have a off-again, on-again kind of, you heard from the local government people how devastating that is to their own decision-making process. So we had to, I think all of us had to ask that question, and I particularly, perhaps because I'd been in on the genesis of it, had to ask that question. And frankly, it's hard to prove that it is a long-term viable source, and I'm the first one that would love to be dissuaded of my concern and have it proved to be a continuing source, because then we'd have a simple problem. But at any rate, this fall, my Resource Landowners Coalition authorized me to explore the development of a project which would create a white paper on funding options and their feasibility. And the questions that are on page 13 of Mr. Detweiler's are for the most part derived from things that we are looking at in that white paper. And at this point, we have a draft, sort of a concept draft of the issues that might be looked at during this white paper process. We don't have any price tags or any values because that part of the homework hasn't been done. It's the white paper at this point, and it'll have many future forms or drafts, but it's really just identifies the list of things that we're looking at. We have also, so we have a first concept draft. We also have been able to get funding to hire a consultant to help us crunch the numbers on this. And those of you involved in county government will appreciate this. He's actually the former county assessor in Glenn County and a fellow named Vince Minto, who is I've looked to for counsel over the years on practical Williamson Act issues, and we've also been offered help with this by informally by the counties, and Vince will be ready to ask for some of that help in a week or two after he gives me his first feedback relative to what kind of a database we need to go after these. For the most part, these are numbers that aren't collected by the state of California for Williamson Act purposes, so they'll have to be developed out of the local information from the assessor's office or the planning departments, and we haven't fully concluded whether we're going to do modeling or sampling or the various techniques that we might use. But anyway, he's on board and he's starting to work on the numbers of this. I'd like to be proved wrong about the weakness and unreliability of the general fund. But we look at it at this point not to undermine efforts to do that, but to get general fund monies, but we look at it as just a absolutely necessary piece of due diligence so that we will know what our choices really might be in this area. Finally, because of a meeting that Paul Yoder invited me to of, I think it was something like 15 county supervisors where we had a discussion, several of them observed that, well, it sounds like it's going to take some time to get something like this through or figured out, even if we're successful in finding funding sources. And we need help now. I mean, we need quicker results, and so I have also been in discussions and have been developing a paper relative to some sort of interim relief program that could possibly work for this year and next year as a bridge to get to a more fully articulated alternative funding program, if that's what we come up with.
Mr. Geyer, Senator Ronstadt has a question for you, sir.
Sure.
Well, now you got me like a kid waiting to open the Christmas presents. I know said Mr. Minto's not ready to bring forth his final work yet, but can you give us a hint of alternative funding sources that you might be thinking about?
Yeah, I would be happy to tell you what's on the first list of stuff we're looking at, and to help you think about it, although this may not turn out to be true in the end, I've sort of tried to break it down into 4 $10 million pieces, or pieces that could raise $10 million if they were correctly funded. The first 10 million piece is based on fees on early contract terminations. Now, we already have a major fee on cancellations, which, as has been mentioned earlier, is a very tiny percentage of what happens. Actually, over the last 10 years, I think it's something like 1,100 acres in the state is canceled annually. But in peak years where there's a lot of development, as recently as 2005, that generated $25 million, which is, 2/3 of the total convention expenditures. On the other hand, in bad years like this past year, it's $2 million or less, and that doesn't even fill up the department's $2.5 million administrative cost first bucket in the fund. So but the big thing about cancellation fees is we put them in 1971 to the state before they'd gone to local government. but they're not earmarked to the Williamson Act Subvention Program. So what the state has right now is sort of they have their cake and eat it too. They get the subvention money, but they don't pay out. I mean, they get the cancellation money, but they don't pay out any subvention costs. So one of the suggestions, the suggestion there is simply to make that dedicated, make cancellation fees dedicated funding. That would also be true with the material breach revenues. That's a fairly new program. There haven't been any monies, as far as I know, actually go to the state yet, but we think they should be earmarked if and when they come to the subvention program. Now, there are two other sources of early contract termination, which are far more prevalent than cancellations. The big dog in that is public acquisitions. Those have always been free. I think I can't imagine that we'd put the same kind of charge, a 12.5% charge on them. I think we're thinking of 1%, 2%, something like that. There's problems in collecting that, but that's a big base. There's 20. In the last 10 years, the department has indicated there's 29,000 acres go out of the Williamson Act every year. Now, we're not sure, and the department isn't sure whether their figures are with regard to all with regard to terminations through eminent domain, because if they're not done through eminent domain or in lieu of eminent domain, then they're not. Then the contract still stays on them, and we wouldn't be charging.
And the fourth one, Mr. Geyer, is what? Did you get four? The name four?
Yeah, the fourth one is annexation protests. Okay. And that's a much smaller universe, but it's 4 times as big as the cancellation universe, and those, if there's been a valid protest back when the contract was entered into.
Don't mean to rush you, but
no, that's fine.
We're moving in that direction.
But that's, I'll try to summarize these 4 hypothetical pots. So that's I think all of those might actually, even at modest levels, overfill the first $10 million pot in a decent year. The second pot is sort of a mixed bag of concepts. One is charges for what I would call displacement compatible uses. Typical such uses are mining, would be some of these alternative energy programs, and I would think we would probably be looking at something like an annual fee, more like a rental fee of Williamson Act ground that isn't available for agriculture while it's out of agricultural service, you might say. So that's one category, which, again, depending on what the volume of this stuff is and what...
When might we expect Mr. Minto's final report to you?
Oh, I think we're months away from that, but we're going to...
Not this legislative year.
Well, not until... I mean, we can get... He'll continue to narrow what we have to do to get this information, but...
We're ready to write a bill.
No, I understand. I understand that, and the counties are really ready to have a bill written.
Mr. Chair.
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Ms. Walkner, we need to wrap up here with Mr. Guy. We got some folks in the audience who want to testify, so...
There have been efforts around my bill, SB 715, which is the Williamson Act reform that has been, this is the second year of a 2-year session. We really do need to get as much consensus as we can, as soon as we can. And that doesn't mean 100%, but we need to move this issue forward, because my fear is that while the counties are in a holding pattern, that's this year. The budget's not going to get any better. So this reform, both of the Act and of the financing mechanism, really are imperative, and we should do that as quickly as we possibly can. So I just encourage you all, get together and let's move this forward. Cancellation fees are an easy one, I think.
Ms. Yamada, you have any comments or questions?
Yes, just very quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Geyer. It is really a privilege, I think, for me to see the person that works so closely with John Williamson. I think Senator Wolk and I believe, share an award with the Williamson name on it. And so this, is very significant for me. And again, thank you for allowing me to join your hearing today. What is your sense about, as you're struggling to determine where this money source would be to restore the Williamson Act subvention? Of course, we'd all like to see a continuous appropriation for the Williamson Act, but it's probably never going to happen. Would you see a proportional restoration of funds rewarding those areas in the state that have done a better job than others for the protection of open space and farmland? Or would you see this sort of just as an equivalent, we're going to treat the entire state in the same way? And of course, that's a little bit of a leading question because I do have legislation also that calls for proportional restoration to reward those areas that have worked really hard. Senator Wolk and I do not want Yolo and Solano County to become San Fernando. We have tremendous growth pressures between the Bay Area and the Sacramento region, and we're going to continue to fight as long and as hard as we can, both for agriculture and the water issues that are related. But just a quick question about how you see that statewide.
Okay. Well, I think that's been under discussion within the Subvention Coalition as back last year, actually, as to whether we needed to tinker with the formula, and I think that's a decision ultimately that may be made by the counties collectively as to how they want to receive the money, and there obviously are going to be different voices within the county constituency on that, but there's various formulas or suggestions floating out there, including the one in your proposal, and I think we probably will try to do something to address the counties of greatest needs or something of that nature. Let me just finish with I said I had 4 $10 million buckets, and because the last ones are easy to describe. The third bucket is simply allow counties to charge a blanket administrative cost fee for their Williamson Act program. We don't specifically authorize that now, and I would just note that if they used a formula to do so of 50 cents an acre for non-prime land and $1 an acre for prime land, that would generate about $5 million out of each of those categories for a total of $10 million. So that's just to illustrate what kind of revenue potential a charge like that has.
And the fourth bucket? And the fourth one is that I think we may be able to make some subvention program reforms that would reduce the cost of subventions, and the two kinds of things that I would look at, or we are looking at, is basically not having the state pay subventions on what might be defined as substandard contracts, which would be contracts under the 10 and 40 acre thresholds or that have no agriculture on them. Not to say you can't have those contracts, but simply the state isn't going to pay for them. And then the second category would be land where there are non-agricultural compatible uses that generate substantial tax revenue for the counties, and therefore where there is no effective tax loss on them. It may be that there's 1 million acres right now of Williamson Act land that we don't pay subventions on mostly because it's been non-renewed, and we don't pay on non-renewals. So, gentlemen, let me thank you very much for your testimony this morning. We do have some other folks who want to testify. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Sorry about the aspect with respect to time. but we're all governed by that. Mr. Carruthers? Anyone else? Mr. Carruthers still here? Anyone else besides Mr. Carruthers wish to speak to the committee? Mr. Carruthers, if you will sit down and give us your name for the record. And
I'm Eric Carruthers. I'm from San Jose. I'm the retired principal planner for Santa Clara County, and I'm a member of the...
Excuse me, you got to close the door. And if you... Excuse me. Hello, in the back. If you're going to carry on a conversation, you need to carry it on outside. All right, go ahead, Mr. Carruthers.
And I'm also a member of the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Santa Clara County Open Space Authority, which was created in public response in Santa Clara County to legislation that you passed for us. It's an honor to be here. I want to reinforce everything that every speaker presented to you before this. Mainly the state has a major benefit from the Williamson Act while it's administered at the local level. It's a major benefit to the state, and so it's appropriate that the state find the means to reimburse counties and school districts. There's some cities for the loss of revenue from this extremely beneficial program. The gentleman from Kern County, the planning director, had spoke of this, and several others. This is but one part of the array of tools that we have to use to preserve agricultural land in California and to make farming viable. The way of preserving the land is to make the farm viable for the family, the owner that administers it. I want to particularly reinforce the comments from the Sierra Club speaker regarding small specialty crop farming in the coastal communities. These are the communities, by and large, that are on the urban edge. There's a new kind of farming I'm sure you're aware of, in addition to the large-scale commodity farming for export to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world. There's this growing small-scale farming of specialty crops that's sold within the metropolitan area. The city of San Francisco, in cooperation with the American Farmland Trust, recently did a study regarding the foodscape of San Francisco, within 100 miles of the city of San Francisco, identifying the array of crops that are sold and consumed within the metropolitan area. This is part of, it's relative to the two pieces of legislation relative to climate change. We have to find ways to reduce the transportation of food to our urban population. We have to find ways of, by increasing the viability of urban edge agriculture, we support the economic dynamics that support higher density development in the urban area. So I know you have many other speakers you want to hear from. I'm tremendously impressed with the paper that was prepared by your staff and by the array of questions that you've presented to your speakers.
Thank you
and
for coming, Mr.
the one
Carruthers.
on water transfer.
Any questions, Ms. Wolk, Mr. Carruthers? All right. Senator Onestad? All right. Mr. Garza?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Pablo Garza with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm just here to say we strongly support the Williamson Act. We've consistently done that over the past years, and I think for many of the reasons that have already been stated, and I'll be brief here. But the Williamson Act is effective and economical. It not only protects the farm and ranch lands enrolled in the program, not only provide critical food production value, but also many environmental benefits, including wildlife habitat and groundwater recharge. We think it's critical that this year we try and find a way to finance the subvention funds, or at least a significant portion of that. And there's been a lot of discussion about Williamson Act 2.0 today, and we're definitely interested in participating in that conversation.
Thank you very much for coming today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today, and thank you for your attendance. We appreciate the fact that you're here.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank you for allowing me to participate today. This was an excellent hearing, and I want to thank you and the staff as well.
You're welcome. Mr. Detweiler will, in fact, along with staff, be preparing a summary of this hearing, which should be available in 3 to 4 weeks.
It'll also be out in the lobby signing autographs.
At any rate, thank you very much for coming, and particularly those of you that live further distance than just Yolo or Sacramento County. Jack, we're enormously impressed that you could come all the way down from Susanville, and Fresno is here today, and we thank you for that. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for your testimony, and we appreciate your being here. This meeting is adjourned. Good job.